Hi, I thought I'd share my experience of a problem I had with my classic car recently. It's a Triumph Stag, but could apply to any old-fashioned type car design with a single coil ignition system. Basically the car was running very roughly, kept stalling at idle. I would only really go properly when you put your foot down a lot. I thought initially it was the carburettor that was flooding, and it turned out to be the coil, the ignition coil, that was gradually on its way out, and the spark was getting weaker and weaker. So it might be useful to share this experience, because if you've such a problem you might want to know how to diagnose it, and I'll show you some of the steps that you go through to do so. So this guy broken down at the side of the road, and there's normally two things it's going to be. It's either the fueling or the ignition. Those are the common things. So the easiest one to eliminate is the fueling. So you could go to the carburettor, try and identify whether you're getting fuel into the engine. So on this motor it's actually converted to be a Holley carburettor, as we see here. And on a Holley, when you move the throttle cable, it actually pumps some fuel into the throttle body. Let's see if we can see that. Yep. So you might hopefully just see, yeah, a little squirt of fuel. As I move the throttle lever up, it squirts fuel. So there's obviously fuel inside the float chamber. The other way of checking it and to check whether your needle valves are sticking is, again, on this Holley, undo this lock nut. Try and take a note of where the adjusting screw is so you don't have to adjust the float level. Undo the nuts, the whole needle valve assembly will then lift out. You can see whether it's sticking or not, see where the fuel is inside the float chamber. There's one for both sides. This is the main one for its like normal running. This secondary side is just for higher revs, higher performance side that kicks in later. If you've got different carburetors like on the original Strongbergs, or you might have an SU perhaps on an old engine, then again look for the float chamber. What you could do is under the fuel line, be careful because this is going to be probably pressurized, so put some rags around it, take it off carefully, see if fuel is squirting out. Obviously don't do any smoking at the same time. Fortunately on this one I put a inline fuel pressure gauge in line with the fuel supply, so you can see it's got reasonable fuel pressure. So fueling didn't seem to be the problem. So the next thing is to identify what is the problem with the ignition. So I was broken down on the side of the road. Fortunately I had my trusty old neon strobe light, which is good for telling you all sorts of things that are wrong with the car. So what I had to do is I had to disconnect this aftermarket ignition coil, which obviously starting to short out internally, was getting weaker and weaker. Temporarily at the moment I've got a more modern style coil I've just slapped into position just to get me home, and with it working correctly, you'll see with the strobe light, one end's connected to the spark plug, the other end going into the ignition lead that was going to that spark plug. And what you should see on the strobe light is a nice regular beat and a reasonably bright light coming out, which we'll see now. So at this point I had to slow down the video because otherwise you get some strange stroboscopic effect between the frame rate of the video and the flashing of the strobe. So this is about 4 to 5 times slower than you'll actually see in terms of the flashing rate, but here you can see with a good coil it's flashing strongly. And next we see what it looks like with the bad coil. And you can see, even though it's flashing slowly again, that it's a very dim light. That very weak flashing light was a good indicator that the spark is very weak, and basically the spark only made it as far as the distributor, and by the time it had then been distributed out across the air gap in the distributor, there was virtually no spark going into the engine, hence why it wouldn't start. The other potential problem you might have, of course, is a problem inside the distributor itself. So most of these old cars, the distributor cap comes off with a couple of these spring clips. It's useful to have a screwdriver to prise them off. Might be able to just do it by hand. So here's the distributor cap off. Sometimes you can get tracking, i.e. carbon tracks, that conducts the spark away from these contact surfaces. This is where the spark comes in, rotor arm here rotates, distributes the spark around these contact points that go to each of the spark plugs. Make sure this little graphite little rod, which is on a spring, is sticking out sufficiently to contact onto the rocker arm. These can wear out sometimes. While it's off, clean all the surface off, especially of any carbon or any white deposits on these contacts. Give it a spray with oil. Sometimes you can get moisture in here that can affect how the spark travels around. It's not unknown for these rotor arms to malfunction, perhaps to have a short in them. Did happen to a friend of mine once. Look for any obvious cracks or tracking on them. Go and give it a bit of a clean up. If you've got a distributor with points still in it, this has been converted to electronic magnetic pickup system. But if you've got the points, you'll have a condenser, which is a capacitor across the points. Again, those can malfunction, short out. You can check that again by looking at whether a spark is generated using your strobe light, and also with a multimeter connected to the low voltage point of the coil to see if it goes up and down as the engine turns over and the points open and close. Now, it will also tell you whether you've got a problem with points or not. And the other thing you can do to finally confirm that it is the coil rather than the low tension side that's causing the problem is to put a multimeter to measure the voltage on the supply side. This is coming from the ignition side, so this should be around 12 volts, and this side goes to the points. So what you could do is just connect this down to a chassis point, down to ground. Take these other wires off it first actually. The points serve the job of doing just that, connecting it down to ground, which puts current through the coil. If you take the connectors off, put a wire off and on down to ground, that will then generate a spark. And if you put your strobe light on the output of the coil and still see a very weak spark, then that confirms it's definitely the coil that's gone, which was the case for this car. If you see a strong spark, then suspect your points or your condenser or your electronic ignition. But for me, the next job is to change the coil. Now, I managed to find quite a nice one on eBay. So this one is a Sparkrite aftermarket coil. The company's been going around for years and years, right back to about the 80s or 70s or so, I believe I heard of them. Probably older. Only 15 UK pounds this one. Comes with a ballast resistor you can either use or not. So the idea of a ballast resistor is that you supply the coil via the resistor during normal operation. So from this comes from the ignition switch. When it's starting, you want to give the spark an extra boost because your battery voltage is a little bit lower, and so a lot of old car systems that are designed for ballast systems will supply 12 volts to this side of the resistor just when the engine is turning over, and gives a boost to the spark. Not always necessary. You could run it all the time through the ballast resistor. Probably could run it all the time direct to the coil, depending on the specification of your points and the rest of the ignition system. And here we have the new coil fully installed. I haven't got around to connecting up the connection from the starter motor to the other side of the ballast resistor yet, but it seems to start perfectly well without it. Get round to doing that one of these days. So let's just see how well it starts. And there we go. Lovely running engine. So obviously in this case it was the ignition coil that was the problem, which is why I broke down. Hopefully this video will help you diagnose a possible breakdown, possible problem with your old classic car. One other problem I did have in the past is related to the wiring getting old and corroded, because this is a 40-year-old car, and things like the fuse box is located over there underneath that plastic cover, but also anywhere you've got a wiring junction, the copper itself can corrode and the wire then gets more resistive. And the problem I had was that the wiring to the fuel pump, which is in the boot, it's actually located underneath this carpeted box cover. In there, as you can see, there's the fuel pump, and the wiring to that, as I say, got too resistive, and what happened was that the pump, which is a sort of reciprocating design, pumps in and out with a spring-loaded return, it would go out but wouldn't come back, so it would pump and then stop, which means of course your fuel pressure stops and the car then stalled. Strangely, if I turned off the ignition and turn it on again, it would then restart. So that was a symptom of the fuel pump sticking, and what I did is just to run another wire from the fuse box back to the fuel pump, and then never had that problem again. To diagnose that particular problem, it took quite a long time. What I had to do in the end was to install this fuel pressure gauge. You can get these on eBay and likes. This is the obviously the petrol feed into the carburettor, and I actually had a little webcam here wired into the car radio screen so I could actually see the fuel pressure, and when it stalled you can see the fuel pressure had dropped off, which means the engine was being starved for fuel, and that was a way of diagnosing what the problem was. So hopefully these little tips will help somebody to diagnose their problems, and well, good luck with yours, and thanks for watching. Bye.